resilience, it's a term that we hear every day. You put on the news, a politician's been particularly resilient, or something's happened in a magazine, and it's one of those words that we all hear. But today I want to actually think a bit back to some of the original impetus for some of my work around resilience, and really think back to some of the other ways in which academics, developmental psychologists in particular, have been thinking about the term. Okay, this slide here, basically, I'll just find out from you here. This is a very live TEDx academic experiment here. How many of you have always had a very low capacity in life? Basically, you've had a pretty good life, and also had pretty good positive outcomes in life. Say if you take today as your stop-off point, how many of you have had it good? Load of you, right? So you're the A's, yeah? How many B's have we got in the room? How many people have really, you were born into adversity, a bit of a shameless family. Myself, I count I'm included in this group here. You've not had it easy, but now you're doing pretty well, and here you are at a TEDx talk. You haven't even had to go to work today. How many of you count? Or maybe you haven't got a job, but you're happy anyway. How many of you count as a B? You're pretty resilient. Yeah, not many. So TEDx, that's quite interesting bit of marketing information for TEDx organisers, that most of you are basically pretty comfortable, always had it pretty good, yeah? So normally when I talk to this slide, I actually say I'm not very interested in any of you. But given that you're the majority of the audience, I'm actually not going to say that today. For those of you who come into this bracket, there's probably a few of you who are just a bit shy, and really you've suffered even more than I have, but you don't want to tell us. But for those of you that come into this bracket, how many of you had a lot of help on the way, really? It wasn't just about your own inner strength. How many of you can think, yeah, someone helped me, a particularly fantastic teacher, for example, or, somebody who worked in a green grocer's shop liked me and actually gave me an extra apple every day, and that made me feel good about myself. How many of you have got that kind of experience? Pretty well most of you. Put your hand up, yeah? So that tells us something quite interesting about resilience. Traditionally, resilience theorists used to think about it as something that was very much internalized within the person. We were or we weren't resilient. But more and more now, researchers looking at this phenomenon have found that actually it's more of a kind of interaction, basically, between an internal resources and an external environment. And thinking back to a really interesting piece of research about educational resilience, for example, amongst African American children, there was this fantastic qualitative researcher who really traced all these what I might call resilient moves or resilient mechanisms in the children's lives. And what she found was that there were a couple of kids in her cohort that really didn't seem to have had any help from anyone to get to in this cohort. It was university education. But just about every other child, all of whom had been born into chronic adversity, pretty well every one of them, even though they might have had brains the size of a planet, they had a helping hand along the way. So there was something that was happening externally, and there's some fantastic stories in some of the resilience literature around what it is that actually supports children. Often it's just a chance meeting with someone. In her cohort, there was a kid who a dentist helped out. They met this dentist, and the dentist said, "Come to my dental surgery after school, keep you out of mischief." And that person went on to study biological sciences. So some of the resilience literature is really making these connections around the external forces that are happening, and often that is actually a relational thing. So it's something that happens between people and the internal resources. And here's a quote here really that sums it up. When we think about the adequate provision of health resources, that's health in the widest sense of the word, basically anything that happens outside of yourself that is good, that supports you to achieve good outcomes in spite of a threat. Now, there's loads of research around on resilience. When I first started getting interested in it, I couldn't believe how much I had to read. I've got filing cabinets full of the stuff if anybody's interested. But a lot of the academic work on it, although it would lay out the stall around the kinds of areas that people might find useful in terms of promoting resilience in children and families, wasn't much detail around on what you actually had to do to make what we might call a resilient move in specific situations. And so that prompted myself and a group of people parents, practitioners, young people themselves, and academics to join together in a group that we've been working together now, a lot of us, over the past 6 years or so, and we've got a website, boingboing.org.uk, where we're basically pooling our resilience knowledge and actually trying to apply some of the resilience evidence base to real life in situations of what we call constellated disadvantage, so basically hardcore disadvantage, the sort of things that you A's in the room have never had to feel in your life. And in fact, in terms of the way that resilience research is going, this is another thing around the title of this talk, Let's Get Real. There's lots now about, in terms of some of the positive psychology movement, for example, where resilience is just basically used as a way of thinking about someone who's fallen over and needs a plaster. It's that kind of... but for our work is very much around serious disadvantage in life. And one thing that we've done, and never mind about any of the detail on this, you won't be able to read that, but what we've done is we've taken the resilience evidence base and summarised it all into a way that into everyday language, in a way that everybody can basically think about how to make resilient moves in the lives of children. Now, I'm just going to talk through how I've applied some of this in my own life. I could use some case study from some of the psychotherapy work I've done, but I have talked a bit about my own family, and my kids have been really up for this. They're my 3 children. They were adopted from, they were 6, nearly 2 and 4 when I adopted them. I actually accidentally adopted them. Which sounds, doesn't really think I'm lying when I say that. No, you obviously don't know the world of adoption. It's changed now, they prepare you properly. But I remember all those years ago, this is like pushing on for must be 15 years ago. But I do remember this conversation with a social worker who said, well, what about children with learning difficulties? Could you have a child with learning difficulties? And I didn't know anything about any of this world. I wasn't a child and family psychotherapist. I didn't know anything. I just wanted to parent and be a nice mum. And I kind of said, well, what does that mean then? And she said, well, it means you'd have to help them a bit more with their homework. So you all laugh. You're all very clever. Because I sort of ticked that box. Oh, yeah, I can do that, So we ended up with a group of children who had learning difficulties, particular mental health diagnoses, various physical diagnoses. And they kind of arrived in one fell swoop on one day. And then that was my life forevermore. Anybody else had that happen to them? No. So you can imagine that was a bit of a drama, and it sounds like, as I recall it, it is almost like it happened that way, because I didn't know anything about, I'd done babysitting and things before, but didn't really know. And I remember there was a baby alarm in the boys' rooms, and I remember one of them saying to the other, I could hear them on the baby alarm, he said, when are we going back to our foster homes then? And the older one said, we're not, we're here now, forever. And he was like, oh my goodness. And I thought, oh my goodness. pretty tough. And the kids have actually, I've gone over this with them, and they're really up for me talking about this. They're quite evangelical themselves about the power of adoption in terms of making resilient moves for children, because there are all sorts of problems with adoption, but for children, older children like my kids from the care system, is a pretty resilient move that was being made on their behalf, because they were adopted by people who would basically die for them. I would die for my kids, like many of you might die for your biological kids. And that is quite a commitment for them to have, someone in their lives who feels that way about them and will try and support them in everything that they do. And this is one of my boys had written this in early secondary school. The teacher asked them to write their autobiography, and basically comes home with this. You can imagine the teacher got a bit more than she bargained for, really. But it's just to show that they had a pretty rough time of it. And I have used the resilience evidence base in my parenting of these children, and it's been hugely helpful to me. One of the things I started to think about from an early age with them, in the resilience evidence base, there's quite a bit about how to support children to actually go on to do something later on in life, to avoid the trajectory of them actually ending up in prison, being on drugs and alcohol, or or basically just being unemployed. And for adopted children, there's quite a high incidence of adoption breakdowns and an overrepresentation in some of these figures of adopted children. So the resilience evidence base, good old thing to try out with them. And this slide here basically is telling us that 20% of young people today are unemployed. Well, disabled children, kids with special needs in that number, massively overrepresented. So again, coming back to think about how could I apply that framework in my own life? Well, the first thing to say in terms of thinking about the resilience evidence base is you have to believe in the almost impossible. I've relied a lot in over the last year or so particularly around thinking about complex adaptive systems and how we as citizens can actually achieve things when everything else around us looks like it's not going to happen. And it's a kind of reason to be cheerful in a way. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek because obviously it'd be great if there was a revolution and everything would change and disabled children would have jobs, but it's not going to happen. So how can we as citizens support these more vulnerable people in our world, particularly UAs out here? Those of you who are worrying about getting your kids into posh schools or anything, I just implore you to kind of put some of your energy into some of this growing bunch of kids now who have got no advocates for them. They've got nobody who's really gunning for them. And there's more and more children even available for adoption and to be fostered, and nobody wants to adopt or foster them. So a bit of energy in that direction would be great. So this picture really crystallises some of the resilient moves I've been working with my children. And some of this stuff is so basic and obvious. And yet when you're working in the context of serious disadvantage, you lose it. You don't know exactly what you should be doing, what's the best way to go forward. Think simple things like getting your kids' hobbies and interests from the word go. And one thing we did with our children was to get them riding bikes. You might say, oh yeah, that's simple, but one of them actually she was a very late walker and actually had lots of occupational therapy interventions. And it was a bit touch and go whether that was something she was going to be able to do. Got them into bikes, one of them took a particular interest in them. So hobbies and interests, and which might lead into some serious talents, very, very useful. This picture here shows two of my kids with Peggy, who's an elderly lady who they've been supporting through the neighbourhood care scheme. Another tranche of the resilience evidence base is about helping children develop responsibilities and obligations. I mean, when I was at school, we always had to pick up litter every lunchtime. Did any of you have to do that? No, you're all too young. But these days, kids don't have to do so much of all that. And I'm a real advocate for getting kids to be involved and supporting other people. And there they are in their neighbourhood care scheme role. And as you can see, my middle son is actually, he's got a pump. You might not be able to see it very well, but he's got a bicycle pump and he's pumping up Peggy's wheelchair. So he's using his sort of skills that he learnt in one arena, which was around the cycling, in this arena there. Another thing, a big issue for children is around finding somewhere for them to belong. Using everything you have in your power to get them a place to belong. And for children, you might be able to manage that in your family, but when they go out in the big wide world, it's not so easy. And certainly the area of playtime, leisure time, after school time was something that was very tricky for our children, and that kind of use of inclusive play schemes and things, really, really helpful. So one of them started off in an inclusive play scheme. In fact, they all went to an inclusive play scheme. And this was thinking about other ways to put in place resilient moves at that time. One of them actually went on to be a volunteer in the play scheme after he'd finished being in it. And I worked together with the person who was the director of the play scheme to actually support him to go on to do an NVQ3 and become a childcare worker at that play scheme. So it's really tricky in the small amount of time I've got now. It sounds easy, doesn't it, that these things occurred, but actually it's the kind of culmination of the different little bits, the tiny little resilient moves, the helping out with Peggy, the supporting her through the neighbourhood care scheme, that gets you eventually into a position where you could do something like this. Of course, resilient moves, they can there's something called positive chain reactions in resilience theory, where one small thing leads to other positive things that carry on. But also, of course, there's negative chain reactions when things get undone and things go wrong, and then you have to start building up your positive moves again. And really, just to summarise, something that I always think is so important, and from the work that I've read, okay, not everybody, how many people in this room are inspired now to adopt 3 children with special needs? Not many takers. However, some of you might be inspired to actually get involved to make some small resilient moves in children's lives. The value of things like befriending, if anybody's got a few £1 million, they can support me in setting up a charity that would provide children with a friend for life. That kind of thing is really, really helpful. And if you all hate kids, you could give some money to some of these charities out there that are going to be going pot now under what's happening in the UK at the moment. But the message really, particularly from complexity theory and some of the data, is that lots of small moves can really, really help. And there's a very satisfied looking boy there. Thank you.